Thank you for joining us here on 9 News Watch. I'm Chris Bianchi, and we've been continuing our daily coverage of the trial of Alex Ewing, who is charged with the gruesome 1984 murders of Deborah and Bruce Bennett and their 7-year-old daughter, Melissa. Now we're getting closer and closer, potentially, to the end of this trial. We're in the second week of the trial in this case, and joining us for daily insight and analysis of this trial is 9 Wants to Know's Kevin Vaughn, along with Nine News' investigative reporter and director of 9 Wants to Know, Nicole Vapp. And Kevin and Nicole want to go straight to you. Kevin, first and foremost, Kevin, you were at the courthouse today. Seems like we're getting closer and closer to closing arguments. What did we see out there at the courthouse today?
Today was the heart of the defense's case, I think. They called a fingerprint expert who testified that there were 31 unidentified fingerprints inside the Bennett home that she examined in 2018, and none of them matched the suspect in the case, Alex Ewing. There was also a stipulation entered before the jury, and for people not familiar with court, a stipulation is something where both sides have agreed on something that the judge will read to the court. It can be for a lot of different reasons. In this case, for example, the jury is not allowed to know that Alex Ewing was in prison in Nevada from 1984 until he was brought here for this trial. So the stipulation read to the jury was that essentially both sides agree he was not in Colorado from January 27, 1984 until he was extradited here. So the stipulation today was about fingerprints from the scene of the murder of Patricia Louise Smith in Lakewood. That occurred a week before the Bennett killings. Ewing is charged in that one. And so they read a stipulation that said a fingerprint examiner had gone through all the unidentified fingerprints from that scene in 2019 and again earlier this year, and that none of those were Ewing's. Obviously, that whoever that fingerprint examiner is, he's not able to testify now. We don't know. He could be sick. He could be out of town. But the jury essentially was just read that his fingerprints were not at that scene either. So they heard that now at both of these murder scenes, no fingerprints from the suspect, Alex Ewing.
Why is it important, and why are they making a point of saying that at this point in the case?
So the defense's case, if you base it on what they said in their opening statement, was that there's all kinds of reasons to believe there were other people involved in this, that this was not a crime carried out by one person. And they have pointed in particular to this bathroom faucet on the second floor of the Bennett home. It was, if you think of it, this is a home where there was a master bedroom, and then adjoining the master bedroom was a walk-in closet and a vanity with a couple of sinks. And then from there, it went on into the bathroom where the toilet and the shower and everything were. And on that sink, on that vanity in between there was a napkin there with Bruce Bennett's blood on it that was found by investigators. And so one of their theories is that the killer cleaned blood off of himself there and then tried to use the faucet to maybe wash his hands off. The faucet, however, was turned off because it had been leaking. And there are fingerprints on those faucet handles that they've never been identified who they belong to, and they do not belong to Ewing. And so part of their argument is there's this evidence here that somebody else was involved in these killings besides the suspect. And so they wanted the jury to hear, that Alex Ewing is accused of killing these 3 people in this house, incredibly, horrendous attacks, and that he left no fingerprints there. Of course, the quick answer for it that the prosecution has brought up every time this issue has come up is that if the person who did these things were wearing gloves, that person would have likely not left any fingerprints at the scene.
And they're also bringing up the fingerprint issue with Patricia Smith, and I thought they weren't supposed to be bringing up too much information about that case. So why are they able to do that?
So the judge ruled that the jury can be told limited information about the Patricia Smith case, information that goes to identifying Ewing as the killer of the Bennetts, information that goes to show how similar the 2 crimes were. And we've talked a little bit about this. They were both surprise attacks, believed to have both been carried out with hammers. There was a sexual assault in each case. The sexual assault victim's body was found in a very similar position in both cases. And so they're allowed to know about those things, and they're allowed to consider the Patricia Smith case as a rebuttal to the defense's assertion that the DNA match that exists is some sort of an accident or a mistake. And so that's why they're allowed to rebut information from the Smith case, even though this is the trial in the Bennett case. And so today, the defense obviously wanted the jury to know that there are none of Alex Ewing's fingerprints at Patricia Smith's home. And it bears noting that they also didn't find his DNA like on her clothes, her boots, those kinds of things, which investigators believe the killer removed those things from Patricia Smith. And again, the same thing. When these people are cross-examined, the prosecution says, if someone was wearing gloves, would they leave fingerprints? Well, no, they would. Would they leave DNA? Not likely. So that's the answer to that, but that's why the defense is going into all this. They're pointing to evidence that doesn't prove that Alex Ewing wasn't there, but also is evidence that, we're used to hearing that the killer's fingerprints are found at the scene, right? And so in these two cases, they were not.
And they only have to bring up doubt. Correct. I mean, really.
Yeah, they have to.
The
The defense does not have to prove anything. I mean, it's up to the prosecution to prove that he did it, not for the defense to prove that he didn't. And their real job is to get jurors to have a reasonable doubt. That's not all doubt, but that's a doubt a reasonable person might have. The crux of this case, though, as we've been talking, is DNA. They have Alex Ewing's DNA at both crime scenes. It's DNA from semen. It's associated with the two sexual assaults that happened, found in the area where the victims who were sexually assaulted were found. And so far, there's not been any testimony that calls into question the presence of that DNA and the implications of it. The defense is expected to have at least one more witness, maybe tomorrow morning, and we'll see if that gets at this at all. But that's sort of the core issue, is the DNA thing. And the defense has been trying to suggest that the police work in this case was sloppy. Evidence wasn't kept, well preserved and stored in some cases. They brought up testimony today about a number of items of evidence where the packaging has been torn open over the years or otherwise damaged, or there was a leak and that sort of thing.
We've heard a lot about touch DNA in relation to other cases like John Bennet, Ramsey. This is not the kind of evidence that we're talking about in this case, correct?
It is not. The DNA in this case came specifically from semen left at both crime scenes. This is not touch DNA. The defense has actually been pushing the idea that there hasn't been enough testing for touch DNA. The idea that, for example, Patricia Smith was killed with a hammer that was left at the scene. And just recently it was tested for touch DNA, and there was DNA found on it from 4 people, but none of them was Alex Ewing. Again, if a person had that hammer in their hand and was wearing gloves, they wouldn't have left DNA on it. They could have potentially left somebody else's DNA if they used their gloves to touch someone. But touch DNA has been an issue the defense has raised. And the interesting point is, yesterday, a very experienced criminal analyst at the Colorado Bureau of Investigation, somebody who has been certified as an expert witness in hundreds of cases, said that CBI no longer does any touch DNA testing on evidence that dates back before 2006. And she said the reason that they made that decision is that in so many of these cold cases, like the Bennetts and Patricia Smith were killed in 1984, that's 37 years ago, evidence handling procedures back then were different than they are now. It's been well documented now, particularly at the Bennett case. Lots of investigators touched evidence with their bare hands. Very few of them wore gloves and those sorts of things. And what this analyst said was they'd been doing a lot of touch DNA in these cold cases, doing several hundred of them, she said, over the years. And they essentially found that it was not helpful in determining who the killer was, because with those evidence handling procedures, they would do touch DNA on something and have DNA from a bunch of unidentified people, not from the killer, and didn't answer what she called the ultimate investigative question, which is who did this.
Interesting. Well, it'll be interesting to see what happens tomorrow, who this last witness is, since we don't really know, and what they're going to say in the closing arguments. And you said they get a little bit of time for those.
They do. So let me talk about the witness first. The The defense suggested today that they're going to be hitting on this touch DNA issue, and in particular on the CBI policy of not testing for touch DNA in these old cases. So we expect this witness to be somebody brought in to talk about that. We don't know for certain who it is at this point. We expect that to be the defense's last witness. They suggested that today, although there's nothing that would stop them from bringing in other witnesses. But once we get through this witness tomorrow, and the defense suggested this would be a relatively short witness. Closing arguments start, and each side gets 90 minutes. So that could take up the whole morning if each side takes that much time. And then what'll happen is, let's just say that runs till the lunch break. They'll take the lunch break. The judge, after the closing arguments, the judge has to read jury instructions, and that can be a time-consuming case. There's 6 separate charges here against Alex Ewing for the murders of the 3 members of the Bennett family. 3 of them allege he did this with deliberation, with pre-planning deliberation, and 3 of them allege that he killed them in the commission of another felony, either a sexual assault or a robbery or something like that. So there'll be extensive jury instructions on each of those 6 counts. And then the jury will get the case, and deliberations will start, and the parlor game will start, which is, how long will they be out? And if they're out more than a day or 2, what does that mean? Who does that favor, the prosecution or the defense? And nobody really knows. Lots of people have put a lot of time into trying to figure that out, but we'll just have to see when the jury comes back with a verdict what it is.
All right. Well, that's great. And Chris, just so you know, we are taking questions tomorrow after we finish with closing arguments. We're going to do an extended version of this, the 3 of us, and talk about the entire case and where it's been and where we are as the jury takes control of this case. And so if you have questions, you can ask those questions on the Blame Facebook page. Just ask them. I put a story up today, so you can ask them right there in the comments of that. Or you can text us at 303-871-1491 and just ask your question right there in the old text.
Yeah, so there you have a couple different ways to make it a bit more interactive. As you mentioned, 303-871-1491 is the phone number. And by the way, you can also get continued updates on the case by texting BLAME, BLAME, to that phone number as well. And if you're curious for a bit more background and detailed background on this case overall, we do have an 11-part podcast, a lot of listening there if you would like to get into a bit more insight on this case, and that is called Blame, The Fear All These Years. That is available on Apple Podcasts. You can also get that at 9news.com/blame. So Nicole, Kevin, potentially getting closer and closer to those maybe closing arguments and perhaps a verdict. So we'll find out about that here in the next few days. As you mentioned, that more interactive portion as we get into the day tomorrow. But Kevin and Nicole, in the meantime, thank you so much for your time today.